There's a sound that's disappearing from American highways. It's the distinctive rhythm of a diesel engine climbing through 18 gears, each shift perfectly timed by a driver who spent years mastering a skill that's now becoming obsolete. For more than half a century, the Fuller Roadranger transmission was the mechanical heart of most heavy trucks on the road. What made it legendary wasn't convenience. It demanded skill. Operating a Roadranger required timing, feel, and experience, and mastering it became one of the defining marks of a professional truck driver. But that era is ending, and most people will never understand what's being lost. The story of the Fuller Roadranger begins in the early decades of trucking, when the entire industry was struggling with a fundamental mechanical problem. Many early trucks in the 1920s and 30s were essentially scaled-up versions of automobiles, and their transmissions reflected that limited thinking. Most early truck transmissions had only 3 or 4 forward gears, which might have been adequate for light delivery work around town, but became completely inadequate when drivers tried to haul heavy freight over long distances or up steep grades. The problem wasn't just the number of gears, it was the massive gaps between those gears and the narrow power bands of early gasoline engines. When a driver shifted from second gear to third in an early truck, the engine speed would drop dramatically, often falling completely out of the range where it could produce useful power. Under heavy load, this meant the engine would bog down, lose momentum, and sometimes stall entirely. Drivers found themselves stuck in a mechanical no man's land, where second gear was too low and screamed the engine at high RPM, but third gear was too high and the engine couldn't pull the load. This wasn't just inconvenient, it made heavy long-distance trucking nearly impossible. Trucks would crawl up hills in second gear, burning excessive fuel and wearing out engines, or they would attempt third gear and lose so much speed that they'd have to downshift anyway, grinding gears and fighting the transmission the entire way. The transition from gasoline to diesel engines in the 30s and 40s made this problem even more apparent. Diesel engines produced substantially more torque than gasoline engines, which meant they could pull heavier loads, but they also had even narrower power bands. A diesel engine might produce its best torque somewhere around 1200 to 1600 RPM, and if the engine speed dropped below that range under load, power would fall off dramatically. What the trucking industry desperately needed was a transmission that could provide enough gear ratios to keep a diesel engine operating within its optimal RPM range, regardless of vehicle speed, load weight, or road grade. This was the engineering challenge that Fuller Transmission Company set out to solve. Fuller had been manufacturing transmissions since around 1916, focusing on specialized gearboxes for trucks and industrial applications. But by the 1940s, the company recognized that heavy trucking represented a massive opportunity if they could solve the gear ratio problem. The solution they developed was elegantly simple in concept, but mechanically sophisticated in execution. Fuller engineers refined the idea of auxiliary gear sections that multiplied the number of available ratios, integrating them into a single heavy-duty transmission designed specifically for long-haul trucking. The result was the Roadranger, a transmission design that would dominate American trucking for decades. Fuller introduced the Roadranger name in 1950 as the company expanded its heavy-duty transmission line for long-haul trucking. Eaton Corporation acquired Fuller Manufacturing in 1958, integrating it into Eaton's drivetrain division and marketing the products under the Eaton-Fuller name for decades. The Roadranger name began appearing on shift knobs, manuals, and service centers across the country. Over time, it became more than just a product name. Among truckers, Roadranger became shorthand for the kind of transmission you trusted when hauling heavy loads through mountains, deserts, and endless interstate miles. The key innovation was the auxiliary section mounted behind the main transmission case, which housed both the range selector and the splitter mechanisms. In a basic Fuller Roadranger configuration, the main transmission might have 4 or 5 gear positions, but the range selector in the back box allowed each of those positions to be used in either low range or high range. This meant a 4-speed main box became an 8-speed transmission, and a 5-speed main box became a 10-speed. But Fuller didn't stop there. They added the splitter function to the same auxiliary section, which allowed the driver to divide certain gears into a direct ratio and an overdrive ratio, effectively splitting each gear in half and multiplying the number of available ratios even further. In practice, this meant a driver could split each gear while climbing a grade or pulling heavy freight, Instead of jumping from one full gear to the next, the driver could flip the splitter switch and momentarily ease off the throttle, allowing the transmission to shift into the higher ratio without moving the shifter itself. Experienced drivers use this technique constantly, especially when hauling heavy loads where even a small drop in engine speed could cost valuable momentum. On a long climb, a driver might split several gears in a row, keeping the engine perfectly within its power band, while the truck slowly pulled its way to the top. When you combined a main transmission with both splitter and range functions in the auxiliary section, the number of available gear ratios multiplied dramatically. The 10-speed configuration became one of the most popular designs, offering drivers a wide range of ratios with a relatively straightforward shift pattern. The 13-speed configuration added splitter functionality in the high range, giving drivers even more control. These transmissions gave drivers something unprecedented: the ability to keep a diesel engine operating within a narrow, efficient RPM band, across an enormous range of vehicle speeds and load conditions. With a properly configured Roadranger, a driver hauling 80,000 pounds up a 6% grade could shift through closely spaced gears, keeping the engine between 1,400 and 1,600 revolutions per minute the entire climb. The engine never lugged down below its torque peak, and it never screamed at excessive RPM. This level of control transformed what heavy trucks could accomplish. Suddenly, long-haul freight over mountain passes became routine. Trucks could maintain consistent speeds on highways while still having the low gearing needed for steep grades and heavy loads. The Fuller Roadranger helped make modern long-haul trucking far more practical and efficient. But this capability came with a significant catch, and it's this catch that turned the Roadranger into a defining element of trucker culture. Fuller Roadranger transmissions were unsynchronized, meaning they lacked the synchronizer rings that allow drivers of passenger cars to shift gears smoothly without matching engine speed to transmission speed. That design wasn't a cost-cutting measure. Synchronizers strong enough to survive heavy diesel torque existed in theory. But in real heavy-duty designs, they were too bulky, expensive, and short-lived. An unsynchronized gearbox was simply stronger and more durable. Heavy truck transmissions needed enormous gears and shafts to survive the loads they carried, and synchronizers would have worn out quickly under those conditions. By leaving the transmission unsynchronized, engineers created a design that was far stronger and far more durable, but it placed the responsibility for matching speeds entirely on the driver. In a synchronized transmission, you can push in the clutch, move the shifter to the next gear, and release the clutch, and the synchronizers will match the speeds for you. In an unsynchronized Roadranger, if you tried to shift that way, you'd grind gears, damage the transmission, and probably get laughed out of the truck stop. The manual said to use a technique called double clutching, where the driver would push in the clutch, move the shifter to neutral, release the clutch, then push the clutch in again, while simultaneously moving the shifter into the next gear. During that moment in neutral with the clutch released, the driver had to let the engine speed drop to match the speed the transmission would be turning in the next higher gear. Get the timing wrong and the gears wouldn't mesh. Get it right and the shift would be smooth and seamless. Downshifting was even more complex because it required the driver to increase engine speed while in neutral, a technique called rev matching, to bring the engine RPM up to match the higher transmission speed of the lower gear. But that's what the book said. What the road actually taught was something different. Experienced drivers learned to shift a Roadranger without using the clutch at all, a technique called floating gears. By carefully matching engine speed to transmission speed and applying just the right amount of pressure to the shifter at precisely the right moment, a skilled driver could move through all the gears without ever touching the clutch pedal, except when starting from a complete stop. In practice, most experienced drivers use the clutch only to start the truck moving. After that, every shift could be done by feel. Drivers listened to the engine, watched the tachometer, and learned the exact moment when the gears would slide into place without resistance. A perfectly timed shift felt almost effortless, the shifter slipping into the next gear as if the transmission had read the driver's mind. But mistime it by even a fraction of a second, and the gears would grind loudly, a mistake every rookie driver made while learning. Learning to operate a 10-speed or 13-speed Roadranger became a rite of passage in the trucking industry. New drivers would spend weeks or months learning the shift patterns, memorizing when to flip the range selector and when to use the splitter, and developing the muscle memory and timing needed to shift smoothly under varying load conditions. The shift pattern itself was complex. The main transmission typically followed an H pattern, but drivers also had to operate the range selector switch and the splitter switch. The controls themselves became instantly recognizable to truck drivers. The range selector switch usually sat on top of the shift knob, while the splitter toggle was mounted on the side of the shift knob. With just those two small switches, drivers could control an entire cascade of gear ratios while moving through the familiar H pattern of the main transmission. For many drivers, the shift knob itself became one of the most recognizable parts of the truck. The classic Roadranger knob usually had the gear pattern molded right into the top, along with the small switches for the range and splitter. After enough miles, drivers didn't need to look at it anymore. Their hands simply knew where everything was. But every rookie driver remembers staring at that knob during their first few weeks behind the wheel, trying to memorize what all those switches actually did. The trickiest moment in the entire shift pattern was what drivers called the big jump, when you flipped the range selector right in the middle of the pattern. In a 10-speed, this happened between 4th and 5th gear. You'd run the main box up through the gears in low range, and then when you hit the top of the low hole, you'd flip the range selector and drop back down to 1st gear. In high range, you'd flip the range selector and drop the shifter back to the 1st position in high range. The transmission would accept the shift, and suddenly, you had a whole new set of gears to work through. Get the timing wrong on that range flip, and the whole truck would know it. Veteran drivers took immense pride in their ability to run a Roadranger smoothly. A driver who could float gears without a single grind, who could downshift smoothly while approaching a hill and keep the engine in its power band the entire climb, who could split gears in traffic and make it look effortless, that driver had earned respect. The Roadranger became more than just a transmission. It became a symbol of professional competence and hard-earned skill. Truckers would talk about their transmissions the way pilots talk about aircraft. They'd debate whether a 10-speed or a 13-speed was better for mountain work. They'd share techniques for specific shift sequences. The transmission became part of trucker identity. Fuller Transmission Company, which became Eaton Fuller after the 1958 acquisition, understood this cultural significance and leaned into it. They built Roadranger transmissions with a reputation for durability that matched their complexity. These weren't delicate gearboxes that required careful handling. They were heavy-duty industrial machines designed to withstand millions of shifts over hundreds of thousands of miles. Roadrangers were rebuildable, with replacement parts readily available and a network of shops across the country that specialized in Fuller transmission service. A well-maintained Roadranger could last the entire working life of a truck, and many did. By the 70s and 80s, Fuller Roadranger transmissions had become the overwhelming standard in American heavy trucking. Major truck manufacturers like Peterbilt, Kenworth, Freightliner, and International all offered Fuller transmissions as standard or optional equipment. Even builders like Mack, which often used their own gearboxes, offered Eaton Fuller units in some models. The 9-speed Roadranger became common in regional hauling applications, where drivers needed versatility but didn't require the full range of a 13-speed. The 10-speed, with its even gear spacing and straightforward shift pattern, became popular for drivers who wanted more ratios without excessive complexity. The 13-speed became the workhorse of long-haul trucking, and many veteran drivers considered it the perfect balance. On long interstate runs, drivers could cruise comfortably while still having the extra gears needed for mountain grades or heavy loads. For decades, if you climbed into a long-haul truck in North America, there was a good chance you were looking at a Fuller 13-speed Roadranger. In the 90s, Fuller introduced the ultimate evolution of the Roadranger design, the 18-speed. This transmission added splitter functionality across both the low and high ranges, giving drivers maximum control over engine speed in every situation. The 18-speed became the transmission of choice for heavy haul applications, mountain driving, and drivers who wanted absolute precision in managing their engine's power band. The Roadranger's dominance wasn't just about mechanical capability. It was about the entire ecosystem that grew up around these transmissions. Driving schools taught Roadranger operation as a core skill. Many trucking companies expected drivers to know how to operate manual Roadranger transmissions before they could be hired. The Roadranger became embedded in the infrastructure and culture of American trucking in a way that few other mechanical components ever have. But technology never stands still, and the same forces that made the Roadranger revolutionary eventually began working against it. In the 90s and 2000s, transmission manufacturers including Eaton began developing automated manual transmissions that used computer controls, electronic actuators, and sophisticated sensors to handle the shifting process automatically. These AMT systems, like Eaton's own UltraShift and later the Fuller Advantage series, used the same basic Roadranger architecture but removed the need for driver skill. The computer would monitor engine speed, vehicle speed, load conditions, and throttle position, then execute perfectly timed shifts without any input from the driver beyond pressing the accelerator or brake. The advantages of automated transmissions were significant and undeniable. New drivers could be trained in days instead of months. For large fleets facing constant driver shortages, this was a major advantage. Trucking companies no longer needed to find drivers who had spent years learning manual transmissions. Anyone who could operate a modern automatic car could now be trained to drive a heavy truck. What had once been a specialized mechanical skill was slowly being replaced by software and sensors. Shift quality became consistent regardless of driver skill, and fuel economy improved because computers could optimize shift points more precisely than most human drivers. Clutch wear was dramatically reduced because the computer handled engagement far more consistently than most human drivers. For trucking companies managing large fleets, the economic case for automated transmissions was compelling. Driver turnover was high, training was expensive, and anything that reduced the skill barrier to entry made it easier to keep trucks moving. At first, many veteran drivers resisted automated transmissions, with the same intensity that earlier generations had resisted automatic transmissions in passenger cars. They argued that automatics couldn't anticipate road conditions the way an experienced driver could. They pointed out situations where manual control was superior, like descending steep grades or navigating slippery conditions. They insisted that driving a truck with an automatic transmission wasn't real trucking. But the industry was changing, and economics ultimately won the argument. By the 2010s, automated manual transmissions had become standard equipment in most new heavy trucks. Eaton has steadily shifted production toward automated transmissions as the industry moves away from traditional manual gearboxes. Younger drivers entering the industry often learned on automated transmissions and never developed the skills that previous generations considered essential. The distinctive sound of a skilled driver rowing through the gears, the mechanical symphony of a Roadranger being operated at the peak of human capability, became increasingly rare on American highways.